I spent 3 years trapped in a house with a mother-in-law who used my chronic migraines as a weapon to gaslight me into insanity. But when she finally stole my medicine to push me over the edge, she didn't realize that a woman with nothing left to lose is the most dangerous person in the room. The air in the house always felt thick, like it was saturated with a fine, invisible silt that settled in my lungs. My mother-in-law, Beatrice, didn't just live with us. She occupied the space like a hostile nation. She was a woman of sharp angles and sharper silence, the kind of person who could make the temperature drop 10 degrees just by walking into a room. I had been married to her son, Mark, for 3 years, and for 3 years I had been fighting a war I wasn't allowed to name. I suffer from severe, debilitating migraines. They aren't just headaches, they're biological blackouts that turn my world into a jagged, strobe-lit nightmare. My neurologist had finally prescribed a specific, high-dosage medication that, while intense, was the only thing that kept me functional. I kept them in a small mahogany box on the nightstand, my lifeline. It started on a Tuesday, the kind of humid, overcast day that acts as a trigger for my nerves. I woke up with that familiar, sickening throb behind my left eye, a precursor to a storm. I reached for the mahogany box, my fingers fumbling in the dim light. I flipped the latch. Empty. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic rhythm of mounting panic. I checked the drawer, the floor, the underside of the bed. Nothing. I stumbled into the hallway, my vision already beginning to fracture at the edges, the world shimmering like a heat haze. Beatrice was in the kitchen, methodically peeling a potato, the rhythmic scritch, scratch of her knife sounding like a gunshot in the quiet house. I leaned against the doorframe, my breathing ragged. "Beatrice," I gasped, the pain already clawing at the back of my skull. "The pills. Did you move the box on my nightstand?" She didn't look up. Her hands remained steady, the potato skin spiraling down in a long, unbroken ribbon. "You've always been so careless with your things, dear," she said, her voice smooth as river stone. "Maybe you misplaced them in one of your little episodes." "I didn't," I choked out, clutching the doorframe as the room tilted dangerously. "I need them. Please. If you moved them, just tell me where." She finally turned, her pale, watery eyes magnified by her thick-rimmed spectacles, looking at me with an expression that wasn't pity, it was triumph. She stood up, smoothing her apron, and walked past me, stopping just inches away. She leaned in, her perfume, a cloying, old-fashioned scent of lavender and mothballs, filling my nose. "Perhaps if you were more focused on your responsibilities as a wife instead of nursing your delicate nerves, you wouldn't feel the need to medicate yourself into oblivion." She brushed past me, her shoulder catching mine with deliberate force. As I collapsed to my knees, the agony turning my world white, I saw her hand drift toward her own nightstand in the hallway, the place where she kept her spare pair of glasses, the ones she obsessed over. My vision tunneled, the edges of the room disappearing into shadow, but I caught the glint of a familiar orange prescription bottle tucked deep inside the velvet lining of her sewing basket. She hadn't just moved them, she had stolen them, and as I drifted into the black void of the oncoming migraine, I heard the faint, satisfied click of her bedroom door locking from the inside. I didn't wake up until the moon was high and cold. The house was silent, but the pain had dulled to a bruised throb, leaving me weak and hollowed out. I sat up, my limbs heavy as lead, and looked at the hallway. The door to Beatrice's room was cracked open just a sliver, the faint light of her reading lamp spilling onto the carpet. The betrayal burned hotter than the migraine ever could. She had watched me suffer, watched me lose an entire day, all to exert a petty, cruel control over a household that wasn't even hers. I thought of the way she looked at me, the smug certainty that I was weak, that I would always be dependent on her mercy. My mind began to race, not with panic, but with a cold, crystalline clarity. If she wanted to play a game of hidden objects, I would show her how the game was really won. I moved through the dark like a ghost, my feet silent on the hardwood. I didn't go to my room. I went to the laundry room, where the tools were kept, and then to the kitchen. My hands were shaking, but not from pain, from a terrifying, electric sense of purpose. I made my way to the living room, where her favorite reading chair sat by the window. She loved those glasses. She treated them like holy relics, polishing the lenses every hour, terrified of a single smudge. She couldn't see the world without them. She was effectively blind in the periphery, trapped in a blurry haze whenever she set them down. I found her reading glasses resting on the side table, just where she had left them when she'd gone to bed. I picked them up, the frame still warm from her touch. I took them to the kitchen, found a heavy ceramic jar, and felt the weight of them in my palm. This wasn't just about the pills anymore. It was about the power dynamic. It was about teaching her that if she could take away my ability to function, I could take away her ability to perceive the world around her. I stood over the sink, my heart pounding a frantic, excited rhythm against my ribs. I was seconds away from destroying the only thing she truly valued when I heard the floorboards creak behind me. I turned, a sharp gasp catching in my throat, only to see Mark standing in the doorway, staring directly at the glasses in my trembling hand. "What are you doing?" Mark's voice was low, laced with a confusion that shifted quickly into suspicion. He was still in his work clothes, his tie loosened, his eyes tired and bloodshot. He looked from the glasses to my face, his brow furrowing as he tried to piece together the scene. "She took them, Mark," I whispered, my voice cracking. "My medicine. She hid it. I was in bed all day, screaming in pain, and she just sat there, watching me through the walls." Mark sighed, a weary, dismissive sound that cut deeper than Beatrice's insults. "Honey, you're exhausted. You probably just knocked them under the dresser again. You know how you get when the migraines start? You're not exactly thinking clearly." "I am thinking clearly," I hissed, taking a step toward him. "Check the sewing basket in her room. Look for yourself. She's playing games and I'm the one paying for it with my health." Mark shook his head, running a hand through his hair. "I'm not going to start digging through my mother's things because you're having a bad day. Put the glasses down. You're acting erratic and it's scaring me." I looked down at the glasses. The metal felt cold, unforgiving. I knew if I put them back, she would win. She would know I had tried to fight back, and she would retaliate with something even worse. I had to make a choice. Be the obedient, misunderstood wife, or be the villain she already thought I was. "I'm not putting them back until she returns my medicine," I said, my voice steadying. Mark stepped closer, his face hardening. "Give them to me, now." As he reached for them, a shadow fell across the hallway behind him. Beatrice stood there, wrapped in a silk robe, her face a mask of wounded innocence. She didn't look at me. She looked at Mark, her eyes welling up with practiced, fragile tears. "Mark," she whimpered, her voice trembling with perfect theatricality. "I tried to help her, I really did. But she's been talking to herself all evening. I think she's having a breakdown." My blood turned to ice. She wasn't just hiding my medicine. She was framing my reality. Mark looked at her, then back at me, his gaze shifting from concern to something much darker, something like fear. He lunged forward to grab the glasses, but I dodged him, sprinting toward the back door, the glasses clutched tight in my fist. I threw the bolt and bolted into the dark, rain-slicked backyard, heading for the storm drain near the fence. I heard Mark shouting my name, but I didn't stop. I reached the iron grate of the drain, and just as I prepared to toss the glasses into the black, rushing water below, I heard a sharp, metallic click behind me. I spun around, and my heart stopped. Beatrice was standing at the edge of the patio, holding my own phone, pointed directly at me, the flash turning the night into a blinding white void. "Smile, dear," she whispered, her voice chillingly calm. The photo was taken. The evidence of my breakdown was captured in high resolution. She knew exactly what I was doing. She had baited me, pushed me, and forced me into this exact corner, turning my desperate retaliation into a display of madness. "Mark," she called out, not taking her eyes off me. "Come look. She's trying to destroy my things." I knew she was unwell, but I didn't think it was this bad. Mark stepped out into the rain, his expression horrified as he saw me standing over the storm drain. He didn't look at the glasses. He looked at me like I was a stranger, a dangerous, unpredictable force. The realization hit me then. She had been laying this trap for months, systematically eroding his trust, planting seeds of doubt until I was nothing more than a jagged, broken woman in his eyes. I stared at the grate, the dark, swirling water waiting to swallow the glasses, the key to Beatrice's sight, her pride, her weapon. If I dropped them, I was proving her point. If I kept them, I was a thief and a vandal. My grip tightened on the frames, the sharp edge of the metal biting into my palm. I looked at Beatrice, standing there in the porch light, her posture radiating a victory so complete it was suffocating. "You think you've won," I said, my voice barely audible over the sound of the rain. She tilted her head, a slow, predatory smile spreading across her lips. "I don't think, dear. I know." She turned to Mark, stepping closer to him, her hand resting on his arm. "We have to do something, Mark, for her own safety. I've already spoken to the doctor. He said if she becomes a threat to herself or others, well, there are facilities." My breath hitched. She had already planned the endgame. She had the doctor, she had the photos, and she had my husband's fear. I looked back at the storm drain, then at the house, my house, which had been turned into a prison. I realized then that there was no way to win this game by playing by the rules. I couldn't just hide her glasses. I had to erase her influence entirely. I took a step toward them, and for the first time, Beatrice's smile faltered. I didn't drop the glasses into the drain. Instead, I pulled a small silver object from my pocket, the key to the basement, where she kept the old, heavy files on her late husband's estate, and held it up, catching the porch light. Her eyes widened, the color draining from her face. She knew what was in those files. She knew that if anyone saw them, her entire history, her entire carefully constructed life, would be exposed as a fraud. "You want to talk about facilities, Beatrice?" I asked, my voice cold as the rain. "Or do you want to tell Mark the truth about what happened to the money?" Behind me, the basement door creaked open, and the lights in the house began to flicker, as if the walls themselves were beginning to tremble under the weight of the secrets about to be dragged into the light. The rain began to lash down in earnest, turning the backyard into a slick, muddy purgatory. Mark stood frozen between us, his gaze darting from my face, contorted with a manic, newfound clarity, to his mother, who had suddenly lost every ounce of her practiced porcelain composure. The silver key caught the beam of the porch light, a tiny, glowing beacon of everything she had spent 20 years burying. "What is she talking about, Mother?" Mark's voice was strained, a tight wire ready to snap. He stepped toward her, his confusion curdling into something colder. "What money? What files?" Beatrice's composure didn't just crack, it shattered. Her hands flew to her face, a pathetic, rehearsed gesture of shock, but her eyes were fixed on the key in my hand with the predatory intensity of a cornered animal. "She's hallucinating, Mark. She's been obsessing over your father's estate for weeks. She's spiraling." "Don't listen to a word she says. She's dangerous." She lunged at me, surprisingly fast for her age. Her fingers, tipped with manicured nails, clawed at my wrists, trying to pry the key from my grip. We tumbled into the wet grass, the mud staining our clothes, a frantic, animalistic struggle in the dark. I felt the sharp sting of her nails raking across my forearm, but I didn't let go. I felt a primal surge of adrenaline, the first thing that had truly managed to mask my migraine in years. "Tell him!" I screamed, pinning her shoulders down with my knees. "Tell him about the offshore account! Tell him why he didn't get his inheritance! Tell him why you've been draining his accounts to pay for medical expenses that never existed!" Mark stood over us, his hands hovering in the air, paralyzed by the sight of his wife and mother tearing at each other in the mud. The house lights flickered again, and then, with a sharp pop, the power died. Total darkness swallowed the yard, leaving us illuminated only by the strobe-like flashes of lightning. In the sudden pitch black, I felt Beatrice's hands scramble for my throat. She wasn't playing the victim anymore. She was fighting for her survival. "You arrogant little brat," she hissed, her voice transformed from a polite, elderly lilt into a low, guttural snarl that sounded like grinding gears. "You think you're the first person to try to expose me? You're just another footnote, just like he was." My lungs burned, the lack of oxygen making the world spin. I swung my free hand out, hitting something solid. A muffled grunt, the sound of glass shattering. The glasses, still in my hand, had collided with the concrete patio steps. She shrieked, a sound of pure, visceral agony, and let go of my throat. She scrambled backward, her hands clawing blindly at the air, her face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. Without her lenses, she was effectively blind, thrashing in the dark, unable to distinguish friend from foe. "Mark!" she wailed, her voice cracking. "Mark, help me! She's trying to kill me!" Mark moved, but he didn't go to her. He reached out and grabbed my arm, hauling me to my feet. I gasped for air, clutching my throat, my vision swimming in the dark. I expected him to shove me, to demand an explanation, to protect his mother. Instead, he gripped my shoulder so hard I felt the bruise forming through my sweater. He leaned in, his voice a low, terrifying vibration against my ear. "I heard the bank statements," he whispered, his tone devoid of all the love and warmth I had ever known. "I heard you both, and I know exactly where the records are kept. You aren't the only one who has been watching her, and you aren't the only one who has been keeping secrets." I froze. The rain continued to pour, washing the mud from our faces, but I suddenly felt colder than I ever had in my life. I looked at his face in the lightning strike flashes, expecting to see a man torn by his mother's betrayal. Instead, I saw a terrifying hollow mirror of the woman currently clawing at the grass. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, heavy object, a burner phone, and tapped the screen. The backlight illuminated his features, casting long, sinister shadows across his eyes. "She wasn't just hiding your medicine to hurt you," he said, his voice as a calm, deep ocean. "She was hiding it because she knew you'd eventually go looking for the files in the basement. She needed you incapacitated so she could move them. And I needed her to keep doing exactly what she was doing. Until you finally snapped and gave me the perfect excuse to clear the board." He turned his gaze toward his mother, who was still flailing in the mud, her cries of "Mark" becoming desperate, rhythmic pleas. He didn't move to help her. He watched her with a detached, clinical interest, like a scientist observing a specimen under a microscope. "The inheritance was never the issue," he continued, his grip tightening on my arm as he pulled me toward the back door. "The issue was always the leverage. And now that she's exposed herself, and you've documented your mental collapse with a public scene, well, the inheritance becomes entirely mine, and you become the convenient, unstable scapegoat for whatever happens next." A heavy iron-wrought gate swung open at the side of the yard, and a man I didn't recognize, dressed in dark, tactical gear, stepped onto the patio, holding a pair of heavy-duty restraints. Mark didn't blink. He just stared at his mother, then down at me, and whispered a question that shattered the last remaining foundation of my world. Did you really think I was the one who left the basement door unlocked for you? The man in the tactical gear moved with a fluid, practiced silence, closing the distance between the patio and the mud-slicked grass in seconds. Beatrice, still clawing at the empty air, stopped her wailing as the sound of heavy boots vibrated against the wet earth. She spun her head toward the noise, her milky, sightless eyes wide and frantic. "Mark!" she gasped, her voice trembling with a sudden, sharp realization that the dynamic had shifted. "Who is that? Mark, make him go away!" Mark didn't answer. He didn't even look at her. His gaze remained locked on me, his eyes dead, devoid of the man I thought I had married. The man in tactical gear, let's call him the asset, stepped into the light of the house, his face obscured by a balaclava. He didn't go for Beatrice. He went for the keys hanging from my stiff, white-knuckled grip. I tried to pull away, but Mark's grip on my shoulder was iron. "Give them to him, darling," Mark said, his tone sickeningly sweet, like honey poured over arsenic. "You've done your part. You've played the disgruntled, unstable wife to perfection. The neighbors heard the shouting, the cameras caught the breakdown, and now? Now the family business is closed for the evening." I looked at the asset, then at Mark. My mind raced, the migraine, previously a dull, heavy weight, sharpening into a white-hot, razor-edged intensity. I realized with a sickening thud in my gut that the medicine hadn't just been stolen to cause me pain. It had been stolen to ensure that when I finally confronted Beatrice, I would be erratic, incoherent, and prone to the kind of outbursts that leave a paper trail of madness. "You set me up," I whispered, the words tasting like copper. "From the very beginning. You weren't ignoring the tension. You were cultivating it." Mark smiled, and for the first time, I saw the true predator beneath the suburban skin. "Marriage is a partnership, love. Beatrice was too sloppy with the accounts. She was living in the past, skimming off the top of a well that had already run dry. I needed her gone, and I needed an heir who was too medically compromised to challenge the probate process when the time came." Beatrice, sensing the shift in the air, finally found her voice, a screech of pure, jagged betrayal. "You can't do this, Mark. I'm your mother. I gave you everything. You were nothing before I set up the trusts." The asset reached us. Without a word, he grabbed my arm and twisted. I dropped the keys, the silver clattering onto the patio stones. They slid toward the storm drain, stopping just inches from the edge. Mark stepped over to the keys, picked them up, and looked at his mother. "You gave me a life built on sand, Mother. I'm just tidying up the beach." He turned his back on her, the cold, calculating efficiency of a man who had already calculated the exact insurance payout for a tragic, accidental death. "Take them both to the study," Mark instructed the asset. "I have the cleaning crew arriving in 10 minutes. Make sure the disorientation is consistent with the level of trauma they've both experienced." As the asset moved to grab Beatrice, she scrambled backward, her hands scraping against the rough concrete of the patio. She was terrified, truly, deeply terrified of the son she had raised to be her own mirror. She looked at me, a flicker of something almost like apology in her ruined eyes, before she bolted toward the side gate. "Run, you foolish woman!" she screamed, the sound echoing through the neighborhood. She didn't make it. The asset moved with terrifying speed, sweeping her off her feet before she could reach the latch. She went down hard, hitting her head against the stone with a sickening thud that silenced her instantly. She lay limp in the mud, her glasses nowhere to be found, her body a broken heap of silk and broken dreams. I stood there, paralyzed, as the asset stood over her, waiting for a command. Mark walked over to me, his shadow falling long and heavy over my face. He leaned down, his lips brushing my ear. "Now, Why don't you tell me exactly where you hid the backup drive for those files? Because if you don't, I'm afraid your migraines are going to become a permanent, incurable condition. I looked down at the mud, at Beatrice's limp hand, and then at the storm drain. I knew I couldn't beat them with strength. I had to beat them with the one thing Mark had underestimated: my absolute lack of anything left to lose. I didn't hide the drive, Mark, I whispered, my voice calm, steady, and devoid of fear. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out a small, black remote, the kind used for a high-end home security alarm system. I triggered the cloud upload the second you stepped onto the patio. And it wasn't just sent to the police. I pressed the button on the remote, and in the distance, I heard the faint, high-pitched wail of sirens, dozens of them, approaching from every direction. Mark's face turned gray. His composure didn't just break, it dissolved. He grabbed me by the throat, his eyes wide with a manic, desperate rage. "Who did you send it to?" he roared, his voice cracking. I looked him dead in the eyes, feeling the cold rain mix with the sweat on my brow. "To the partners you've been stealing from for the last 5 years. They aren't interested in a trial, Mark. They're interested in a settlement." Just as the flashing lights of the police cruisers began to wash over the house, the asset let go of Beatrice's limp body and pulled a suppressed pistol from his jacket. He aimed it not at me, but at Mark. "My instructions were to ensure no evidence remained," the asset said, his voice flat and mechanical. "And that includes the partner who made the deal." The world narrowed down to the sound of rain hitting the patio and the metallic slide of the pistol's action being pulled back. Mark's hands dropped from my throat as if he'd been electrocuted. He stared at the asset, his face a mask of sudden, frantic realization. He had orchestrated a coup, only to realize he was merely a mid-level player in a much larger, more lethal game. "Wait," Mark stammered, his bravado evaporating. "You don't understand. I have the leverage. I have the files. If you kill me, you lose the only access codes." The asset didn't blink. He wasn't a bodyguard, he was a liquidator. "The partners didn't ask for the codes, Mark. They asked for the vacancy." My heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird, but the migraine had vanished, burned away by the sheer, cold electricity of the moment. I knew I had perhaps 3 seconds to move before the gunfire started. I didn't look at the gun. I looked at the storm drain, then at the sprawling, dark yard. I lunged, not away from the violence, but directly toward the concrete lip of the patio, throwing my weight against the asset's knee just as he began to squeeze the trigger. The shot went wide, a sharp, muffled pft that shattered a decorative garden urn behind us. The asset stumbled, his balance compromised by the weight of my body. It wasn't enough to knock him over, but it was enough to break his rhythm. Mark didn't hesitate. He scrambled toward the house, his survival instinct overriding his ego. "Get the files!" I screamed at him, my voice cutting through the rising wail of sirens that were now inches away from the property line. Beatrice, who I had assumed was unconscious, suddenly groaned. She shifted in the mud, her hand blindly groping for anything solid. Her fingers closed around a heavy, jagged shard of the broken urn. The very urn the bullet had just decimated. She didn't have her glasses, but she had the primal instinct of a cornered predator. As the asset recovered and raised the pistol toward me, Beatrice lunged from the mud, swinging the jagged ceramic shard with everything she had left. She caught the asset in the side of the neck. It wasn't a clean strike, but it was enough. The asset gasped, the pistol slipping from his hand as he clawed at his throat. He turned, his eyes wide, and collapsed into the wet grass, the life draining out of him into the mud he had been sent to police. I didn't wait. I scrambled to my feet, my legs shaking, and grabbed the burner phone Mark had dropped. The screen was still active, flashing a sinking progress bar. I saw the sirens now, blue and red strobes reflecting off the wet windows of the house. The police were tearing through the hedges, weapons drawn. Mark had reached the back door, but he froze when he saw the flashlights cutting through the dark. He looked at me, then at his mother, who was sitting in the mud, weeping softly, her hands covered in blood, and finally at the dead man on the patio. He knew there was no way to explain this, no way to spin a tale of mental health crises when the cleanup crew was now a crime scene. I walked toward the gate, stepping over the asset. I felt cold, hollow, and remarkably light. Mark stepped toward me, his face a desperate ruin. "We can say it was self-defense," he begged, his voice barely a whisper. "We can tell them he broke in. We can still walk away from this, just us, like we planned." I stopped and looked at him. I looked at the house that had been my prison, the woman who had been my jailer, and the man who had been my architect. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the flash drive I had actually been carrying, the real one, the one with the offshore account logs and the recorded conversations from the last 3 years. "There was no us, Mark," I said, my voice steady. "There was only a target, a handler, and a weapon. And I'm done being all three." I tossed the drive into the middle of the yard, right at the feet of the first responding officer who vaulted the fence. The police swarmed the yard like a rising tide. They didn't ask questions. They tackled Mark before he could open his mouth. They handcuffed Beatrice, who didn't even fight. She simply stared into the darkness, her eyes hollow. The woman who had wanted to control everything, finally losing her grip on reality itself. I stood in the center of the chaos, the rain finally letting up. An officer approached me, his hand on his holster, his face stern. "Ma'am, are you injured? We need you to step back." I looked at my hands. They were covered in mud and the cold rain of a long, dark night. I felt the absence of the migraine, the absence of the fear, and the profound, terrifying silence of a life completely wiped clean. "I'm fine," I said, my voice clear, "but I think you'll find everything you need in the basement." As they led Mark and Beatrice away, two people who had spent their lives trying to bury everyone else, I walked toward the front of the house. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. The house was gone. The life was gone. And for the first time in years, the silence wasn't a threat. It was a blank page. I reached the street, the flashing lights painting the world in violent hues of red and blue. I kept walking, away from the sirens, away from the house, and away from the woman I had been. I didn't have my medicine. I didn't have my home. And I certainly didn't have my mother-in-law's glasses. But as I turned the corner and disappeared into the gray, misty morning, I realized that for the first time in a long time, I could see everything perfectly.